Hello, this is James and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein's relationship, a visual timeline, original title, archive link, and that's an archive link that's posted by Dr. Who 07, and that's an archive link to an article from CNN Politics K-File, Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein's relationship, a visual timeline. And yeah, of course, Reddit, they're all about Epstein these days because the Orange Man is probably implicated in it. But, it just goes to show you that, Reddit has no values other than Orange Man bad. There's tons of other of the elites implicated in the Epstein files as well, but Reddit only seems to care that the Orange Man is implicated in them. And yeah, it just goes to show you, Orange Man bad, as I say in pretty much every episode, is the end-all be-all of Reddit at this point. Orange Man could sneeze, and Reddit would go ballistic over it. So that just goes to show you that, Reddit really has no values other than Orange Man bad at this point. Or at least the vast majority of it. The normie Reddit, I should say. Then we have Homan. President Trump doesn't have a limitation on his authority to make this country safe. There is no limitation. This is exactly how authoritarian regimes justify abuses of power. Posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And that's a cross post from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, that's a pitfall that both major parties fall into. They think safety is much more important than freedom, and that's why they're pretty much a uniparty in that regard. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is we need freedom much more than we need safety, but both major parties are very safetyist in that they'll, justify whatever government authoritarianism they want to as long as they think it keeps people safe. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Ohio requires buses for private school kids. Public school kids have to find their own ride. And that's a post from TheGuardian.com, posted by Donald Key. And I personally think, all transportation should be private rather than public. I think if Ohio does want to require public transport buses for any kids, they ultimately have the legal monopoly on these. The government has the legal monopoly on these forced to enforce whatever laws it wants to. But I personally think transportation should be held privately rather than publicly, especially when it comes to private schools. I think if you want public transportation for private schools and people want to pay for that, I think that's fine. But, ultimately, I think private schools should have private transportation rather than public transportation. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have Trump proposes literal socialism, government ownership stake in Intel from finance.yahoo.com, posted by XGHTie737. And yeah, that just goes to show you that, the two parties might market themselves as different in regards to, economic policy and the separation of big business and big government. But, both of them increasingly just agree that big government and big business should be joined at the hip. That I would say that's always how it's been to some extent, but I don't think they've ever been more open about it as they have been over the past decade or so. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Everyone is So Scared Inside the Smithsonian as Trump Attacks Art History from HuffPost.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Fed News subreddit. And yeah, this reminds me of a post I made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit recently. Libertarian researchers on state running cultural institutions. It's not, I said it's not the worst thing the U.S. government does. I would say that would be bombing and drone striking the shit out of the Middle East, but I definitely think it's up there. When the state runs cultural institutions, whether they be museums or broadcasting services like NPR or PBS, you could throw websites in there as well. They're going to be biased to whatever the whims of whoever is currently in power are, as evidenced by this recent story about the Orange Man and the Smithsonian, interestingly enough published by NPR. This isn't to say that what these institutions produce is inherently bad. I would much rather have any hypothetical children might be watching PBS Kids and fucking Cocomelon, honestly maybe one of the worst measures of the century so far in regards to brain rot. But as per usual, the libertarian position is for them to be privately funded rather than publicly funded. If people want to pay for them through voluntary taxation, I think that would be fine. But even in that regard, I think there are definitely going to be a number of things they would want to pay for first, such as healthcare and emergency services. And yeah, personally, it might be well-intentioned for the government to run cultural institutions, but, personally, I don't think that's very much the libertarian perspective. Libertarian perspective is privately run museums rather than publicly run museums, just like, the libertarian perspective should be privatized as much as possible, or at least as much as realistically possible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, with ICE's budget now larger than that of the Russian army, we can expect a lot more of these deportations, posted by Helpful Feeding, and that looks like a link they made to a story from r/news. 4 years old U.S. citizen fighting stage 4 cancer deported to Honduras, family takes legal action, and they linked to a specific comment chain. During his first administration, they tried to deport foreign patients from Boston Children's Hospital, which is one of the finest pediatric research institutions in the world. These particular children have been invited to the U.S. to take part in clinical trials for rare diseases. Without them, the trials lack the requisite number of participants to continue, meaning if they had life-saving treatment, now no one gets it. In their own countries, these were guaranteed death sentence. There is no end to the depravity of this xenophobia. And I guess I would agree with that. Reddit, of course, it might be willing to twist the details a bit since they're so anti-Trump, but I definitely do think, the Trump administration is overly deporting people. You could make the argument that it's for safety reasons, and I guess that's okay. Ultimately, if people, I personally more in freedom of safety, but ultimately, if people do want to support deportations and strong border security through voluntary taxation, I think they should be able to. But that being said, that doesn't inherently make it right. I think it's kind of like, Biden, he was very lenient. He seemed to be more lenient when he came to deportations. ICE was still a thing under him, but, I don't think they were as obsessed with deportations back then. Maybe they were, I don't know. Reddit, of course, only cares what the narrative is. They didn't talk about ICE at all during Biden's tenure, but now that Trump's in power, it's one of the only things they can talk about. But regardless, I think the libertarian position is, you can't be too lenient when it comes to deporting people, but you can't be too overly authoritarian as well. Ultimately, I do think there is a place to deport some people like gang members or, cartel members. But, ultimately, you don't want to go too far in the opposite direction and start deporting kids with cancer as well, like they seem to be doing here. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Gavin Newsom's press conference was stormed by Border Patrol guards with machine guns from themirror.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And, yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But, ultimately, the government is going to justify whatever it wants to do. I'm sure when Gavin Newsom's president, if he ever gets elected, I personally would never vote for him because he seems like he's from the same DNC swamp that they send all their candidates out of. But, if he's ever president, and I'm sure, and they have armed guards storm a press conference of a governor when he's president, Reddit would downplay as much as possible. But since, Gavin Newsom's on their team, this is suddenly the worst thing ever when it happens to him. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for it. I think it's all just political theater. But, of course, Reddit's pretty much all just theater at this point. They're all on the same team, despite what they might want you to think otherwise. Big club and you ain't in it, George Carlin, as I always like to say. Then we have, he really is the origin of a lot of current issues, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that looks like a tweet from Alexis, bring back one has we, and that's Sassy Black Demon. She replied to a tweeted tweet from Keir Sullivan. Whenever I discuss a really fucked up law on Google its origins, and it's a picture of Ronald Reagan, he says his web connects them all. And then her reply was, no, like he literally set the score of every Asian American down to high fructose corn syrup. It's like every day he woke up and showed something new to dabble in. And I would agree with that. Yeah, to some extent, I think Reagan's a lot of the source of a lot of our problems currently because he was the one who really first pushed in the neoliberal establishment when he first got elected. With that being said, I would say there are even worse people when it comes to him. Like FDR really centralized power in the federal government as well. So did Woodrow Wilson. I would say one of the biggest ones of all was Abraham Lincoln, because prior to Lincoln, the states arguably had more power than the federal government. But after Abraham Lincoln, uses the federal government to crush the sovereign rebellion, suddenly, the federal government has shown its supremacy, and there's no going back from that. Now the federal government is the one who's ultimately superior in all instances over the state governments, and despite some cries of states' rights since then, you'll ultimately never seem to go back to the part of the era when the states arguably had more power than the federal government. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have prosecutors clear Florida officer who punched man in traffic stop from BBC.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but it just goes to show you the state's always going to be looking out for its own. And just because a lot of Redditors say, ACAB, doesn't mean, they'll ever actually be held accountable. Just because, the thing is that the state's always going to look out for its own. They control the police, they control the military, they control the court system. There's pretty much no way to win against them. Maybe they'll eventually throw you a bone, get rid of qualified immunity eventually. But even then, the state's always going to be inherently looking after its own unless they can throw them under the bus for narrative reasons. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have Trump aides create loyalty lists for right-ranked corporations by support from finance.yahoo.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross-post from the Moderate Politics subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't think they should do that, but ultimately, they can justify making whatever lists they want to. And yeah, just because they have corporations that they want to support them doesn't mean the Democrats don't do it as well. A lot of the Democrats, they control all the NGOs and give them money when they're in power, but Reddit doesn't care about that because that's their team doing it rather than the other team doing it. And as usual, most people only have teams in politics rather than any actual values. Then we have American soldiers kneel to roll out a red carpet at the steps of Putin's plane, watched by Putin's security guards, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the Europe subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, I do think, someone like Putin's going to want that, and, you got to negotiate peace with him eventually. The war needs to end at some point. A lot of Redditors are saying, Trump's Russian asset for meeting with Putin, but, you do have to negotiate peace at some point, and, Ukraine might have to give up some stuff. And, people say, why isn't Ukraine at the table, too? And the thing is with that is ultimately Ukraine's pretty much just the U.S. puppet state at this point. And, I personally don't care for it, but, it's clearly just a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, despite how Reddit thinks Ukraine is this great independent country. It never really was, especially after the color revolutions the CIA orchestrated there, such as, I think they had the Orange Revolution there or something, and then the Euromaidan. The U.S. ultimately needs to, I think, be the one to negotiate peace. And, it seems like, Trump didn't get close to that getting done yet, but, hopefully it will come sooner rather than later. And then we have Israeli unit tasked with smearing Gaza journalists as Hamas fighters, report from TheGuardian.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And, yeah, I personally don't really care for Israel as much as I don't care for Ukraine. I think the U.S. needs to go out of both of those countries. But, just because, it just goes to show you how the government can smear anyone they don't want to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. I think if Israel wants to justify what's going to justify, just like the rest of every other country, they should be able to. But that doesn't make it inherently right. And I'm glad that Reddit is one of the few things that I agree with Reddit on, is that Israel needs to be held accountable for their genocide in Gaza. But sadly, I don't think that's coming anytime soon. Then we have Sandwich Theater, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. That's a cross-post from the Work Reform subreddit. And that looks like a meme. If you need any more proof that the DC police take over his theater, here it is. 20 cops showed up at the sandwich thrower's home to re-arrest him after he'd already appeared in court. 20 cops, not sure anyone who thinks murder is a problem in DC can defend this spectacle. And I guess they would agree with that. That just goes to show you how the state can send the police after you for whatever reason they want to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, I personally think this is just more political theater than not. especially when, you got a bunch of murderers running around in DC, but they only go after a guy who threw a sandwich at someone. But, ultimately it just goes to show you that, the state can justify whatever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they have the legal monopoly on the use of force. And then we have the richest Americans die earlier than the poorest Europeans, posted by from Vice.com, posted by Goran Person 777. And yeah, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if Reddit or Vice in this instance, I pretty much think all the sources that Reddit uses are pretty much Reddit adjacent. That's why, as I said in a previous episode, all the news outlets oftentimes post their own stories from their own accounts rather than have a third party do it, since they're pretty much one and the same at this point. All the progressive news outlets like Vice or HuffPo or NY Times or Washington Post all post from their own accounts to control the narrative rather than have a third party do it. But regardless, I won't be surprised if they tilted the date a little bit to get the narrative they were wanting, because that seems to be very much the part of the course these days. Don't let the facts get in the way of good narrative. Tilt everything to your narrative. But regardless, it just goes to show you that money doesn't buy life. People are gonna die when they die, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Everyone has to die at some point, and that's my thoughts on that issue. And yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.